What's up, guys? Shout out to the homie Dr. Dank. It's Dr. Dank. Kid keeps me smoking dank. Give me 1 second, we'll get this going. Hopefully get High Ground Ganja in here tonight. Have us a little chat. Hope everybody's doing well on this, I think it's Saturday. My days are a little mixed up. Hope everybody's been having a good week. Mine has been busy, if nothing else. Just give me just a minute, guys, and we'll get homie in here and get a chat going. Got some big things planned coming up soon. I'm working on a project now. I'm thinking it'll probably be our late summer project. And I've got some selection done that I'm really stoked about. And yeah, I think we're going to put up some really nice hash plants soon. That's kind of the goal with the next one. The last couple have been more about focusing on profiles specifically, like trying to do gassy strains or trying to do fruity, a particular profile. And then this next one is just going to be gross hash plants. Let's see. Maybe I can just add you. South Africa? What time is it in South Africa right now? Oh, it's the middle of the day for you guys now. I will say this about South Africa. You guys love your fucking weed. Not to say they don't in a lot of places, but man, you guys, South Africans love your fucking weed. I have been absolutely surprised with the number of people from South Africa that support my page and my channel and my and most people probably wouldn't believe this, but for the longest time, yeah, that UFC fight right now is pretty banging. I wasn't paying for it, but for the longest time, on my page, when I go into the analytics of my page, one of, if not most of, the top countries that support me, one of them is South Africa. Like one of the, or two or three of the top pages, the top countries and cities that support me are all in South Africa, and that is awesome. Yeah, and I mean, a lot of it is Jacques. I just want to say, a ton of it is Jacques. Those guys with Leapfrog Genetics do just awesome work. They've been working with my gear for quite a while. And yeah, I mean, I can definitely tell when those guys start pushing stuff, because I start hearing more and more stuff about the Nag Champa. And another quick thing before I hop in high ground here, we're about to be working with the Champa Rose too. Their cut, the rose, well, not the cut, but I'm working with some F2 seeds that they made with the Nag Champa, with the Champa Rose. All right. I can hear you, but I can't see you. But for some reason, the last 2 or 3 times I tried to do these, it wouldn't show me both people. So if I think everybody can see us. Let's see. I'm trying to pull it up on my laptop real quick. Are you there?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, but I can't see you. Okay, they say they can see you, so this is another one. For some reason, the last 2 times I did lives directly on Instagram, it didn't show me you guys, yeah, there we go. It didn't show me the second video. Normally it does a split screen, but for some reason it only shows me myself. So it's a little weird for me because I'm not seeing you, but we'll be fine. Anyway, how are you doing this evening, man?
I'm doing great. How you doing?
Doing good. I've had a really busy day and just hitting the end of it.
Yeah, same.
Yeah, I was just talking. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, same here. Long
Yeah,
day.
I just was just talking with these guys about some kind of projects I'm working on right now. My whole thing for this next drop that I'm working on is all just strictly hash plants. And so it's one of those things where, like, normally I tend to focus on a particular profile when I go into things. It's almost always kind of profile forward. I'm usually working gassy stuff or fruity stuff, or, I have a particular thing that I'm going for profile wise. But this next one was just strictly, and it's kind of funny because a lot of what I do focuses on hash plants. But this is really just throwing. I went through my seed collection and everything that I thought would just dump. And so we're working with a bunch of that stuff now.
How are you identifying the stuff? Are you doing any analytics? Or,
As far as like washing, as far as hash goes,
yeah.
yeah, I mean, generally, yes. I mean, short answer, yes. Most everything ends up in the wash, and that's generally how we find out what works and what doesn't. But a lot of it is also stuff that I've worked with to some capacity. Stuff I kind of know what to expect going into it. But yeah, I mean, definitely at the end of the day, washing trikes, I think that, all of the guesswork and all of the, does this, doesn't this, all of that goes kind of out the window until it hits the bag. Once you hit the bag, you really get to see what's going to perform. Because, I mean, you can work with strains that are generally great hash plants, but at the end of the day, until you wash them, until you breed them, you don't really know.
Is it a return or is it just a effect or flavor that you're looking for in your selections?
All of the above. I mean,
All of it.
generally speak, yeah, because I found that a lot of people right now that are breeding for hash, it almost ends at yield. So it's like, does it yield? If the box checks yes, then that's it. We don't really care. Flavor wise, it doesn't really matter. And for me, it's still really important to kind of focus on flavor. I mean, at the end of the day, washing specifically is such a tough process on trichomes, on strains, on finding strains that are going to wash well. It's such a tough process that it takes time. I mean, there's really no way to do it but to run strains that work, to find strains that work for parentage. And it's one of those that, like, it's not just good enough for me that it dumps. If it dumps 6% in the bag, that's awesome. But if it dumps 6% and then we lose most of it to the rosin bag, that's not really all that great. If we're running 6% yield and the hash that we get at the end of the day just kind of tastes like hash and doesn't have like a really robust flavor of some sort, then you've got a bunch of shit. It threw down, but now you're stuck with a bunch of shit. So it's always kind of that balance of, I think when we talk about wash strains, I think everybody would just love strains that throw down, beautiful 6-star, right out the bag, doesn't need to be rosined, 90% of it's perfect. That's not the case for most great wash strains. I mean, most of them still, let's be honest, the true 6-star plants are super, super rare. Super rare. And so a strain that's just going to work straight out the bag doesn't necessarily need to be rosined. And that's the goal, the holy grail, right? Is just greases right off the bag. No problem. But the reality is most strains these days are going to get washed and then pressed. I mean, that's almost a reality. 99% of it is going to get washed and pressed these days. So also finding strains that hold up well to the bag, hold up well to the water, and then still put out something in the end that's tasty. That's really as much the goal as just it throws down a ton.
Right. It's like a whole new frontier. It's like what everybody wants right now.
It really is, man. And it's one of those things that I think the market is a tough thing for the simple fact that as a breeder, you kind of have to be everything to everybody, right? So if you only focus on hash, then inevitably people hit you up and go, well, I just need great flowering strains. Like I just need stuff that's going to yield well and that's just great flower. So at the end of the day, it's not great enough to just focus on one thing. Like you really have to be versatile. You really have to kind of focus on a little bit of everything, and at the same time still try to be, you know, true to what your brand is and what your marketing is and things like that. For me, it was always profile forward. So if I'm looking at hash plants, even my goal is not only to find washers, but to find washers with unique flavors. And that's, you know, that's another one of those that, like, I think we all say that, but I think at the end of the day, like, to truly put flavor first, and then it's tough. It's really tough. In just a sense that, like, what's great in flavor to me might not be relevant to somebody else. So it's hard because you don't want to just chase the market and chase hash or chase hype and just chase what's popular. But at the same time, you don't want to, you don't want to get caught in a trap of just focusing on what's important to you. So it really is a delicate balance of, you know, finding stuff people are going to relate to and purchase and pick up and want to run, but stuff that I feel okay at the end of the day that I'm running. I'm not really, I'm going to go grab 2 hype strains and just bang them together, and I'm just going to make a huge marketing thing out of it. For me, they have to hold up. Like, they have to hold up as strains. They have to hold up on their own. But yeah, so
Hey,
let me ask you a question, man. You breed as well, right? That's your big thing?
yeah,
Like you do breed seeds?
I wanted to ask you a question real quick,
Okay.
jumping back to the hash.
Yeah.
When you're selecting, are you selecting out of open populations or are you doing one-offs? How are you getting the stable analytics that way?
So this is a funny one. And this kind of came up this week, and somebody was discussing one of the posts on my page. We were talking about what to do if you want to start a breeding program and you only have a couple of seeds of the strain that you want to work with, right? This is probably the one situation where open pollination is the best.
Yeah.
So if I'm starting a project and I want to work with a particular strain and I only have 5 seeds, right?
You
And
want
it's
to amplify it.
something
Yeah.
means the most to me. I have to run this strain. The best thing to do is take all your males, all your females into an open pollination, and then to take those seeds and start a program. Now, the
Yeah.
other thing is you don't need 500 seeds to do proper selection. It's great if that's what you have, but of the greatest strains of the last 25 years, very few of them came from large population seed hunts. Like,
Right. So
that's
that
just
first step that you're talking about is an amplification of the original population.
absolutely. So
So
all
that
you're doing
it's
is
like the
taking
first step in any preservation project, you know, because
absolutely
generally when we're preserving stuff, we don't get a lot of stock. Sometimes we do, but generally we're starting out of a handful of seeds, like you're saying.
right.
So just amplifying it and then having enough to start the program and be able to
Absolutely.
pull back on
So
it, bounce around.
generally speaking, I don't do a ton of open pollination unless it's a situation like that where I have a limited number of starting material, or it's a situation where I literally want as many possible phenos and variations as I can find. So if it's something like a good candidate would be something like the Deep Chunk Project. So the Deep Chunk Project, as I've worked with it, has largely been inbred. We're doing 1-to-1 filial generation crosses. There's not a ton of variation, but we're at a point where we'd almost like to take a little bit more variation into the line. to try and see a little bit more of, because we've worked in one very precise direction. So that's another one where you might take two or three, maybe four or five different females and males, or, as many as you have at the time, bang them all together and just make, add a little bit more variety to a line that's already getting pretty thick. I'm going to be honest with you. Like I've been working seeds for, a little while now. I'm not a huge fan of overly inbred seeds. That's becoming something that I think is going to be a talking point in the next decade. Is, breeders who literally, when you get a strain, instead of running 10 seeds and getting 10 different variety phenotypes, you're going to get a pack of seeds and they're all going to look like one strain. Well,
Yeah,
for 20 years, for 20, 30 years in cannabis hybridization, that was the goal. When you look at the guys that did it in the 90s, that did it in the early 2000s, before kind of the modern explosion of polyhybrids, these guys were taking landrace strains, they were starting proper hybrid lines, and then they were working those lines in a filial direction, in an inbred direction, right, to weed out most of the variety. Well, that's not been a priority for a long, long time.
Well, the explosion of cloning in the 90s kind of changed the trajectory with that. Everybody jumped back. I mean, that was like a whole new deal when everybody started cloning everything. Then you had, homogeneity in the room and stuff, and it helped production. And so line breeding kind of fell back because that took a lot of weight. So, yeah.
I think a lot of that too, the market dictates. So at a certain degree, nobody's hitting me up and asking me for F8s for $600 a pack that are all look the exact same. And when I say that, like, most people go, well, holy shit, it's a lot of money to pay for a pack. Well, if you want a true line, a true bred line, it takes years. It might take a decade or more. And I don't know that the average customer is willing to incur the sort of charges that, for a breeder, make those sort of projects worth doing, right?
Yeah, it's got to be a subsidized project right now because with the economy and the market the way it is, it's like, how do you even afford a 10-year project? That's a back burner. It takes a lot of time.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the notion for some consumers is that, well, that's just what goes into it. And the reality is that's years of eating cost before you're going to get to something that's, truly a true breeding line. And I'm not saying that work isn't worth doing. I just don't know that right this minute the market dictates that that's what people want.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I hear about it on forums, and it's a great thing to talk about amongst us, but I don't think it's one of those things that the average consumer is really cognizant of or begging for. Most people that hit me up that want seeds want unique. They want something different. They want something that their friends aren't smoking. They want something unique. And that's not normally breeding.
The gear that has a lot of filial generations tends to bring some issues up. Just getting that old too. I like to really take stuff like that and do the outcross and kind of bring it back to something else and see. That's what I did with the deep chunk that I got from you. I really only saw 2 phenos in that. I did 2 packs, and I really like the leaf stacker pheno.
Which one did you run?
The deep chunk.
I mean the F12, 13, 14?
F14. It was F14. Yeah.
So by the 14s, there's very little variation. Like if you ran 200 of them, you might not find one plant that's intensely unique. Like it's very true breeding. In the time that I worked with it, so when I started with essentially F8s, they still had some variety in a good way and in a bad way. there were really two general kind of plants, one that have tiny little golf balls, and then there was another pheno that I found that stacked really nicely,
That's
right?
exactly
And
what I
so
saw. Yeah,
that's
those same two
the
phenos.
one that I've worked with. The more stacked variety is the one that I've generally tried to focus on more, because the other one is really tough to kind of, it doesn't yield super well. Some of them have a little bit more resin, but as far as indoor production, the further you go back in that line, the tougher it is to find stuff that grows well indoors. So when I started with the eights, there was still some herm issues. It
Did
just
you
didn't want to
did you
grow
ever
well
see any
indoors.
did you ever see any stunting in the line?
Not really. I mean, what do you mean? They're just slow growing, slow veg?
Slow growing or maybe plateauing out, at a smaller state. That's what I've seen
They're not.
with
I
some of
will
the
say this:
outdoors.
if you want a plant that's going to finish tall, you need months of veg. Like, they are super slow. They tend to throw huge leaves that aren't really all that efficient sometimes. They tend to block a lot of other stuff, and it's got a really typical old world Kush look, like a master Kush, where it wants to throw just one thick center stem. And working with it, you can actually train them really well. The hardest thing that I found in the time that I worked with it was just finding plants that wouldn't freak out indoors. So it's an outdoor plant. It's a plant that was bred for decades to be grown outdoors. And so as we intently want to bring those inside and we want to try them indoors and we want to run them under artificial lighting, that was when it didn't always love things. It started to get a little bit like they would start to herm, and it was normally because it just didn't like indoor artificial lighting. Like, if you ran it outdoors, no problem. They'll get nice bushy big plants for you.
Yeah,
So
it's
that's generally
low
been my
light. It's used to
focus.
being under the manzanita, right?
Right. Yeah, right.
Yeah,
Right.
that's like
That's
the
generally been
classic
my
indica move.
right.
Low light, under tree cover, easy to hide. That's why I was so stoked to see that big leaf stacker pheno because that's what I saw. Because up here at high altitude, I'm at 8,000 feet and I can grow tomatoes under tree cover
Yeah.
and and they actually almost do better in some respects because the sun is so harsh. And same way with the cannabis.
Yeah. Yeah, it's with that one. My goal has generally been focusing on plants that can grow better indoors. Just stability. That's something else we don't talk about a lot amongst us. Is that the notion of not herming in the world of cannabis breeding is a fairly new construct. Now, I know that sounds funny, but in the 90s, that wasn't what people were stressing about. They weren't necessarily stressing about herms. It wasn't that big of an issue back then. But it was also acclimating strains to growing under artificial lighting. And the more that we've tweaked artificial lighting, the more that we've started to have issues with plants not wanting to fucking, stress. Almost most of our indoor stress is because of lighting stress, whether it's they just don't like the spectrum, they don't like the intensity. That's another one. They don't like it's too bright, it's not bright enough. And these are all kind of things that, like, as breeders, to worry about that hasn't been a huge issue for 75, 100 years. Most strains of cannabis were bred to be grown outdoors. So even the notion of breeding for indoor growth is a fairly new construct in the world of seed growing. It seems like something that we should have been dealing with day one. And here's one that I bring up all the time. And I don't know that everybody loves this discussion, but the breeder that literally wrote books about cannabis breeding, DJ Short, bred Blueberry, one of the hallmark strains of cannabis genetics, probably bred it for 20 some years, and it herms like a motherfucker. It is probably one of the most unstable old school strains that I can think of. We don't talk about it a lot, but the reality is that wasn't their priority back then. It really was it? It was more of, can I get it short? Can I get it to stay under the lights? Uh, Deep chunk is not the strain. Okay, so this is kind of weird. Deep chunk is not normally the strain that I tell people is super strong. The tests of it are not really, you're probably not going to see tests of 30% on that one. It's another high myrcene strain, and that's really where its benefits lie. And it was the first strain that kind of taught me that myrcene was why super heavy strains knock you out, like that super heavy indica thing. Um, and so it was the first strain that started my path of trying to find heavy myrcene strains, heavy indica strains, heavy cushes, and that's why I kind of figured out eventually that's what I loved. Like when I was growing up, the strains that I always kind of attracted to more were heavy, lethargic, narcotic, like strong. I need my ass kicked or I'm not happy.
Yeah. My whole litmus for what I bring in, I run it outdoors at high altitude, and that takes care of any weakness. It gives me a chance to check things out. And then I find that after I do that and I bring it in, it's pretty good to go. It can go in or out, because if it's, what survives the first generation outdoors toughens it
Yeah,
up.
but I will
And
say
then,
there's mountains. Once you get up close to that light, man, that's where those big resin heads are.
yeah, it's been awesome running some of the landrace strains up here and seeing them really express themselves and seeing the
Do you
resin load.
prefer heavier indica strains?
Um, I
I mean, for
generally,
outdoors.
well, that's a funny question. I've had to work towards indicas just because they're hardier for the high altitude short season. I'm looking at a lot of the places in Afghanistan and Pakistan. They look pretty similar to where I live.
Right, right.
So, but I do love sativas, and I come from, yeah, just loving action weed and puffing sativas all day. And then,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know,
It's if you can get them to finish, man. Especially if you're only growing outdoors, like you don't have all the little kind of tweaks and tweaking light cycles and little things that you can do to kind of get them to finish a little faster. But when you're growing sativas outdoors, man, it's a passion project. Like you really, it takes forever, but you really have a lot more um, just variables, generally speaking.
yeah, I have a few strains that I've made that really work that are sativa for outdoors.
Yeah,
Generally I have to pool by October, sometimes the last week of September.
yeah.
But lately I've been letting it run. We've had pretty late warm finishes, not a lot of rain. It's been nice. But where
And
I'm at, I get like 15 inches of rain a year, so it's super arid.
yeah, yeah. And that makes, I mean, that while that's great for maybe growing in some ways, that makes drying and curing a serious challenge.
Yeah, I have to run a humidifier for sure.
Yeah, it's funny because I came from kind of best of both worlds, worst of both worlds. I'm originally from the East Coast, probably in one of the most humid states in the country. I mean, through the summer, we used to get 90 some percent humidity every day. And some of my first grows when I was much younger were outdoor grows in high humidity environments, right? And, I ended up eventually in Denver, which is kind of close to what you're saying, altitude, very arid, super dry most of the year. And it's really a challenge of balancing the good things and the bad things, right? With the more humid, you deal with more bud rot, you deal with botrytis, you deal with kind of more pests because it's warmer. Whereas where it's much more dry, you kind of deal with a lot more of the stuff on the back end where drying can go really rough for you. Like on the East Coast, it would take me 2.5 weeks to dry weed before I was ready to put it into a jar to cure. 2.5 weeks sometimes. when I was, pretty much my whole time growing in Denver, 2 weeks and you would be so dry you'd be looking at dust. Like if you let it sit for 2 weeks, it would literally be just nothing left because it's so dry. So,
Yeah,
5 days
you gotta
and then
put
you
a
jar it
lot.
and
You
then
gotta
you have
put
to
a
pull
lot
it
in a
out
small
again.
box. You gotta put a lot in a small box, a small room. That's one thing I find when I can pack a room, I can, and it's sealed and it's got controls. I can really just get it just right, so I don't even have to burp it. Just take it off, bag it
Right.
once. Yeah.
One of the other things that I noticed, and this is one of those things that I don't think gets talked about a lot about high altitude, is just how much it affects your sense of smell. Um, Years into living in Colorado, and weed just does not have the same sort of smell that it does in like more humid environments.
Huh.
And so I think this affects us in a lot of different ways. It's not just in the immediate that it's not as strong to smell, but it's essentially affects the expression of terpenes. So one thing that I would notice is that strains that I would get in, on the West Coast in Denver, if you had the same strain and it magically appeared in a more humid environment, and as soon as you open that jar, it just stinks. And so this was something I kind of noticed before I moved to Denver, was just that in more humid environments, terpenes in general express more. They're stinkier, they're louder, they're just more expressive. But in this is where I'm not quite sure if it's just the super dry environment or if it's pretty much like a more altitude thing, like just literally affecting your sense of smell. But I for the first 3 or 4 years that I lived in Colorado, I thought everybody there just grew garbage bud. Like I just thought all the weed was trash, which was really shocking to me because I had always heard great things about Colorado grown weed, right? And so for the first few years that I was in Colorado, I just assumed everybody there grew garbage. And then I had an experience where I took something home with me, and as soon as I opened it back at sea level, it smelled so loud, it literally smacked you in the face. And it kind of blew me away. um, Somebody just said East Coast weed smells musty. I had a buddy one time. I had been growing weed for 15 years on the East Coast at this point. I had a buddy ask me like, "Why does all your weed have like a super skunky smell to it? It's like it doesn't matter what strain." And I'm like, I think it's just the environment. I think, especially when we start to talk about skunk strains, I think a lot of the expression that people associate with skunk tends to be more expressive in certain environments versus other environments. So I don't think there's not skunky weed. I think it can really be affected by where you live. So if you're in somewhere on the East Coast where it's humid, generally more humid environments, that's going to smell a lot different than if you live in the middle of Arizona where it's just dry all the time and,
Well, I never really thought of it like that. I've spent a lot of time out west, so I've been on the East Coast a little bit when I was younger, but that was long enough ago that I don't remember much about it. So,
and I don't mean to say that the whole of the western part of the United States is dry. There are just more like really huge, dry, arid areas when you look at, Arizona, some of the deserts, some of the mountains. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think it's not necessarily the region, but I think it's just naturally, and that's something that affects us, whether we're drying, whether we're growing, our humidity level is super important, especially in the later stages as we're growing bigger flowers and things like that. So it's one of those things that, like, when I talk to people a lot of times and people are discussing situations with their grow, one of the questions I almost always have to ask is just like, where do you live? Like, what is the normal climate where you live? Because if you're somewhere where it's extremely dry, my advice is going to be different in fixing your solution or fixing your problem than it is if you live somewhere like West Central Florida. Like there's just so much nuance to your normal grow environment that it's tough to give somebody a super easy answer when you don't necessarily know how well their plants are uptaking things in a humidity level or an arid level. And then drying, like I said, drying I think is one of the biggest things that gets affected by it, just because you're talking about huge windows of difference between a dry climate versus a really wet climate.
Yeah, I don't have any problem smelling weed up here, man. I've always, I mean, I when it's harvest time, I can smell it on the wind.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I mean, where did you said 8,000, 9,000 feet?
8,000 generally. Yeah,
Yeah, that's
divide.
that's pretty. That's pretty close.
Yeah,
That's pretty close to.
I have gardens from 7,500 to like 9,000
Nice.
feet.
All outdoor. Everything you do is outdoor.
No, not all outdoor. I do some indoor.
Gotcha.
Yeah. I've done tons of indoor over the years, but I kind of scaled back in 18. You know, there wasn't I didn't feel as much need to keep pushing on any
And
scales.
what do you tend to focus on breeding wise? Flavors, particular flavors, strains.
Um, well, like I was saying, I like sativas and I like plants that I can actually run outdoors and and they produce in my short season and produce weed that I want to smoke. I'm a little
Right.
more selfish than you. Like I really follow my personal taste, probably to my detriment sometimes. Um, Sometimes I do projects like I just did a project with the Texada Time Warp, which is just
Yeah.
like piss strain,
Yeah.
Not probably many people want to mess with it. Like the seeded nug that I was testing I was getting around 6%, and I attribute a little bit to the energy of the seed production, but pretty low, but very uniform, very interesting. Um, it has gorilla roots from Canada, so
What
it's pretty hardy. It's
what state did
super
you
seed.
say again? I'm sorry.
It's Vancouver area is where
Oh
it's
wow.
an heirloom from up there.
Nice. That's where you're at?
Oh no, I'm in South Colorado, South
Oh,
Central
I
Colorado.
got you. I got you. I got you. I got you. I got you. Man, I spent some time around that area, but about the time you get about an hour south of Denver, it turns into the American Southwest real quick.
Yeah, well,
Tumbleweeds, rattlesnakes, the
well,
whole the state of Colorado is crazy. Just humidity. I mean, temperature wise, climate wise, there's everything. There's a little bit of
yeah.
everything.
When I think of Colorado, I don't necessarily think of Denver. I mean, no shade on Denver.
No,
I
you're
go to
right.
Denver, but I mean, Colorado's pretty diverse.
Yeah.
It's a huge state. Awesome, both sides of the divide. Yeah.
Yeah, somebody said it's Red Dead Land. Yeah, it does very much is. It's stark. Like one of the parts of South Colorado, man. You realize real quick, man, that it's a different world. Everything gets real remote. The people down there don't like to be fucked with. They like their space. They like their privacy, and that was the pervasive thing that I found in Colorado. Lots of good people, especially when you started to get away from the city, but just know how to move because they're very much people that don't want to be fucked with. There's a reason they're not close to people. But yeah, man, once you got off into some of those mountains, there's a lot of really awesome people in Colorado. Denver is kind of almost the best in some ways and the worst of some ways of Colorado because it's so much transplants. It's so many people that aren't from the state that don't really have a vested interest in being there. Whereas when you kind of get out of Denver, you tend to find people that have been in their little spot for a while. They're happy. They don't really need a whole lot in the city. So like you said, it's a strange state, but it's a really diverse state in both climate and in people.
Yeah, inconvenience is a virtue in some places, but it's really awesome in the, high desert to have like a bona fide water source and what you can do with that in such a dry place. I mean, you
Yeah.
can turn dead land into living soil, or, dead soil into living soil, just with good water.
Yeah, I saw a lot of groves when I was there that, just people that just had backyards full of weed. And it's just like it would always be in some strange remote. There were times where I looked at people and I went, "You guys love growing weed," and it's not just because you do it and because you're passionate about it. It's because that when you look at the climate in so many places, especially outdoor in Colorado, you really have to love it to grow outdoor weed. That April hailstorm that comes almost every year that drops, massive hailstones. Like that's the least of it.
Yeah,
The temperature swings, you could have 60-degree temperature swing in a day. No problem.
yeah,
And that's usually the hail day.
yeah. I don't even plant out till June. Okay, I
Yeah.
wouldn't take those early season
Yep.
chances. But that's where I'm coming from is, loving
Yep.
outdoor field culture, guerrilla,
You
like
gotta love it. You gotta
what
love it, man.
that's
Yeah,
where
it's
it all
tough.
comes from. Like, large hidden patches that used to make sense to run,
Right.
because it did a lot of work having to do
Right.
all the hiking and all the gardening,
Are
but that's
you native?
kind of,
Are you native
no,
to
I'm not
Colorado?
native. No,
Uh,
no, no,
gotcha.
no. Born in Kansas City, Missouri, traveled all over the country and decided to settle in Colorado in '96.
Yeah. Man, I will say, having driven that stretch across the country many times, I always found that Missouri is that point. So I'm a college football fan, right? And so Missouri just entered the SEC in the last 10 or 12 years or something like that. And I always said to myself, yeah, I don't know if that's quite the South. But when you're driving that across the country, the minute you leave Missouri is when everything goes from green and lush and pretty to just drab and gray and flat. And it's like, it's that moment where you definitely go, yeah, I'm not in the South anymore. I'm not even on the East Coast anymore. Like everything after Kansas going west is just, I mean, after Missouri going west is just flat, windmills, lots of gray. Yeah, as somebody who's pretty much used to seeing just lush everywhere on the highway, the first time I drove clear across the country, it was just stark. It was
Yeah,
just stark.
you just gotta stick with it for 10 hours till you can see the mountains.
Yeah, that's pretty much it, man. You just drive till you see the mountains. I always thought the funny thing about Denver is that it's at such a high altitude, and just Denver particularly, it's at such a high altitude, but you don't ever really feel like you're going up. Like if you come across the country, you're not like, it's not like you drive into the mountains and now you're going around a spiraling mountain. You're literally doing 8,000 feet in elevation in almost no time, and it happens pretty quickly from when you enter Colorado to where you're at elevation. Yeah, it's one of those crazy states. Like I said, the smallest mountain on the East Coast, I don't think really touches mid-sized mountains of the middle of the country.
Yeah, elevation is a big deal. It changes how plants grow quite a bit. You
Yeah.
know, I've heard that like for every 1,000 feet in elevation gain, it's equivalent to 500 miles in latitude.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, and I mean that's the crazy thing when I said, about resin production is that when you're that much closer to the sun, like THC and trichomes and a lot of that general purpose is sun protection, right? And it's like the reason most of the biggest trichome hash plants came from around the equator was because they're so much closer to the sun physically. So over long periods of time, they adapt that to protect the plant from the sun. And it's like mountainous regions and, around the equator are almost always historically where the best hash plants came from. It's because for hundreds of years they were bred almost as close to the sun as you can get on the planet, right?
Yeah, it's amazing to like when I opened that Sheboygan population, I had quite a bit of the seed stock. I opened quite a bit. I opened like 60 seeds for the season. I ended up having like 25 males. But it, just seeing the open population and thinking about how long that's been going on to get where it's at, and still maintaining like so much vigor and expression and diversity in the population. It's pretty amazing to see. It's a blessing to be able to see it on, a small scale, but um, it's nice to see things on a larger scale too. But it takes a little bit more planning for me. A lot of times on indoor projects, I'll do like multiple generations, or I'll pull out of the same seed lot multiple grows to run through more numbers if I want to keep seeing the population. I've done that.
Well, see, one of the things that I don't, this is kind of funny because I think for people that have followed my work for a while, that this is kind of obvious, but I'm going to tell how the soup is made. I run very little from cut. Almost everything that I do, and in a few short instances, this isn't the case, but most of what I do, I run directly from seed. This gives me a couple of things that I think when people run my gear and they run stuff next to stuff other people run, a lot of people come back to me and go, "Man, your stuff is so much faster. It's more vigorous." It's because I don't use cuts. I don't use a ton of cuts. There's a couple situations that I can think of where I have used legacy cuts that I keep or, things like that. But almost everything I do is straight from seed. Well, what this does is you've got nothing but explosive growth when almost everything you have is from a seed itself. And then what I see so many problems with other breeders that almost run exclusively cuts is the sort of problems that I don't usually have. Vigor, explosive growth, just being able to hand seeds to anybody and they be able to grow them well. And it's one of those things that like I don't knock on them. I've run cuts for, my entire 20 some years of growing weed. But when I'm making seeds, almost everything I try to do each round comes from a seed pop. So it's like everything is hunted out. And that way, the big thing is that I don't ever want to get into a fight about whether I have the real cut or it's the cut or cut from somebody. If I really want to strain, I'll go out and find a cross somebody made of it and then run through those seeds, find a plant that best represents what I want, and then use that. And then I don't have to fight about where it came from because I popped it from a seed. And there's a lot of, when I tell people that are getting into breeding and things